So good afternoon and happy Wednesday. Welcome to our August Revenue Roundtable on digital service taxes. Before we begin, we want to touch on some light housekeeping. The last 10 to 15 minutes of the session will be a Q&A. We're recording the presentation part of the session, but not the Q&A. All the slides we're using today will be shared out with some additional resources after the session. And just as an exciting update, we have a landing page now for all of our revenue roundtables. So you'll be able to watch past sessions and access any resources all in one place now. I know that you might feel nostalgic for our fair share tax fund that we've done in the past, or perhaps a Great Ohio Tax Shift. So please check that out, and we're excited to have it up. So as for today's topic, we will be taking a broad look at digital service taxes, a policy area that has attracted growing attention as more economic activity moves online. Digital service taxes can take many forms and apply to a range of activities ranging from cloud computing to online marketplaces to streaming services and software platforms. That said, today's discussion is going to be focusing primarily on two specific areas that have emerged in policy debates across the United States and internationally: digital advertising taxes and data mining taxes. These taxes seek to address the ways large technology companies generate value in the digital economy, whether through selling targeted advertising or collecting, analyzing, and monetizing our data. So today, we'll examine the rationale behind these taxes, how they're structured, some of the legal, practical challenges they face, and the lessons that policymakers can draw from jurisdictions that have already adopted or are considering them. And so, next slide, please, Kate. I am extremely excited to announce that we're going to be joined today by Nick Johnson, Senior Fellow at ITEP, who focuses on state and local policy, and Michael Maserov, a board member of ITEP as well, and they will be getting more into the meat of these different types of taxes. Next slide, Kate, please. So for our agenda today, I'm going to give you just a landscape of what's going on in Ohio, so you can have that in the back of your mind as we kind of progress and learn about how other states are grappling with this and kind of what they're moving towards. And then we'll move to Nick, who will cover digital advertisement taxes, and then finally Michael, who's covering data mining taxes, and then the Internet Tax Freedom Act and other legal challenges to DSTs. Next slide. So to understand what digital service taxes are or what they could become, it is helpful to begin with a brief discussion of how these services are taxed more generally. Next slide. In Ohio, most sales of tangible personal property, meaning physical items that can be touched, such as clothes, electronics, or furniture, are subject to the sales tax unless a specific exemption applies. Services, however, are treated differently. Only services specifically identified as taxable under Ohio law are subject to a sales tax. As a result, if a service is not listed, it's generally not taxed. And Ohio is not unique in this regard. Many states have historically struggled to tax services, whether they're traditional services like dry cleaning, professional services like legal counsel, or newer digital services. Challenges stem from a combination of social and economic policy considerations, tax administration complexities, and lobbying efforts. So state sales tax systems remain largely orientated towards the taxation of goods rather than towards the full range of services that drive the modern economy. And the distinction matters because the US economy has changed dramatically over time. Economist Ricardo Marto of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis observed that the services sector is essentially the bulk of economic activity. Since the 1950s, services have grown from accounting for roughly 1/2 of the US GDP to more than 3/4. In other words, it's an ever-growing share of economic activities now occurs through services rather than the sale of physical goods. The rise of the digital economy has accelerated this trend over the past several decades. Tax systems have gradually adapted to account for many digital goods, such as downloaded softwares, ebooks, or streaming content. Yet many of the largest and economically significant digital services remain outside the traditional tax framework. And digital services, if you're curious, can include things like online advertising services, social media platforms, search engines, cloud computing, streaming services, and the list goes on. And while the shift to the digital economy has been happening, data and personal information has been, increasingly seen as a valuable commodity. Many digital service companies generate revenue by collecting, analyzing, and again, making money off of our data. Yet the economic value created through these activities remain difficult for states to capture under their traditional tax system. And so that's why many states are considering how to tax these services and to modernize the tax code to ensure that this kind of additional economic activity is we're benefiting from it as well. And so at this point, you might be asking yourself, you talked about many digital services and that a lot of them aren't captured under the sales tax. Do we actually tax any digital services at the moment? And the answer is yes, but it's a very limited number of digital services, as you can see here, streaming services, satellite TV, certain telecommunication services, bundled digital goods and shipping, and so on. And so some, but not a large range. And as you find folks noted from our agenda, we have a particular focus on digital advertisement services and data mining, both of which are not in any language found within this list. Next slide. So while we don't tax either of these services under our sales tax, I do want to point out that we actually do tax digital advertising under our commercial activity tax. The CAT tax, which is the shorthand for that, is Ohio's broad business tax on gross receipts, which means revenue a company earns from the sales and services in the state. Beginning in 2025, businesses with more than $6 million in annual Ohio receipts pay the tax at a rate of 0.26%, with the threshold for businesses, with the threshold for when businesses need to pay the tax being so high, it applied to businesses. Like the threshold for when businesses need to pay is quite high. It used to be 150,000 in 2023. So there are concerns that the CAT does not fully capture the value generated by large digital platforms, particularly those that derive substantial value from targeted advertising. And it's really difficult to know exactly how much revenue Ohio generates from taxing digital advertising through the CAT, because digital advertising is not reported as a separate taxable category. It's instead included within broader professional, scientific, technical service sectors, or NAICS codes. And the entire sector for which we believe that digital advertising would be captured under generated approximately $120.5 million in revenue in fiscal year 2025, but only a portion of that can be attributed to digital advertising activities. So that's the landscape in Ohio really quickly. And I want to hand it over to Nick now, who will now walk us through how other states are considering and implementing digital service taxes as well as revenue opportunities. All right, take it away, Nick.
Thanks so much, Aditi. I really appreciate it. I appreciate that intro. What I'm going to talk about draws on a paper that ITEP put out in May. I really started digging into this issue over a year ago, building on work that Michael and others had done to try to get our heads around how all the different ways we are taxing or failing to tax the emerging economy, and homed in on the question of how we tax advertising, and specifically targeted digital advertising. For reasons that I'll explain. Maybe a quick note about terminology, because your introduction was really terrific, and one of the things I appreciated about it is that you zoomed out a little bit to talk about digital services tax, sort of the broader sphere of digital services and how they're taxed in Ohio. One thing I'll note is that sometimes in the discussions that you see in the news about digital services taxes, you'll hear references to the taxes that exist in the UK or in France or in Spain. And the tax base of those taxes is still revenue. So they're very equivalent to what I'm going to be talking about today, which I'm calling advertising taxes, targeted advertising taxes. The terminologies vary a little bit. The base varies a little bit. There's, as Michael will explain, there's potentially legal implications to slight tweaks to how you articulate what the it is that you're taxing. But it's really useful to think about both the broad sweep of what we're taxing and to understand, as we say, that the revenue stream that's driving all of this stuff, with some exceptions, is advertising. So in the UK, for instance, it's a tax on the revenue of these big digital companies, and that tax is raising $1 billion a year in the UK at a pretty low rate, 2% rate. So go on to the next slide, just to give you a sense of the scale for what this could potentially mean in Ohio. Um, if you took Ohio's existing state general sales tax rate, and you applied it to you assumed that you think about Ohio's share of personal consumption nationwide is about 3%. And then you apply that to what we know about the scale of the advertising market in the country generally. If you applied Ohio sales tax rate not to all advertising, you might expect to raise somewhere in the vicinity of $900 million a year. If you took newspapers and traditional broadcast outlets out of that, you're still looking at over 700 million. If you focus a little more on programmatic ads and search ads, and I'll define that term in a minute, you're still looking at over $500 million a year. And the thing to remember is that most of this is coming from three large corporations. It's Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon. That may change over time, I'm sure it will, but right now it is a highly concentrated market. So, these dollar figures are obviously quite significant in Ohio and in other states. And this explains why I think more and more states are starting to move on taxes like this. Go ahead to the next slide. So, just to recap what Aditi already shared with you, the Ohio sales tax was enacted in 1935. The economy looked different in 1935. It was designed for a 1930s manufacturing economy. And the reason it did, there's two reasons. One is that the economy as a whole was mostly tangible goods. That's what our economy produced for the most part. That's what people were consuming. The other was administrative. It would have been hard, 90 years ago, it was much harder to track the sale of services and apply tax to it. Obviously, that has changed, and as the quote from the Ohio Department of Taxation, Department of Revenue indicated, it's that various services have been added to the tax base. Advertising has not been added to the tax base in Ohio. This is true in most states. And I think part of it was, for many years, it's certainly been considered. And in a lot of places, it was considered essentially a sort of a cross subsidy for local newspapers, for television stations, for radio stations. Obviously, there's a political dimension too. Those entities had a pretty strong political voice. But you go all the way forward to 2026. The economy has obviously very much changed. That advertising exemption is still in place. Next slide. So we have this economy now where much of the wealth generation is occurring in the area of social data, the collection, manipulation, and deployment of vast amounts of data about us. And this actually affects lots of areas of the economy, but none more than advertising, I think. Advertising is not the world of Mad Men anymore. We're not in the era of Coca-Cola jingles and glossy newspaper inserts. That's not where most of the money is going in advertising. Go to the next slide. It's mostly what we call digital, or particularly programmatic advertising that is targeted to us based on our what the platforms know about our personal data. This gets auctioned off very quickly in real time to advertisers, and it's just exploding. And so, two things to notice in this graph. One is the disappearance of traditional advertising, newspapers, radio, television, these things where you're just sitting there and it's being shown to everybody who is subscribing to that publication or to that broadcast. And the second thing you're seeing here is the overall increase as a share of GDP. So Google search is not considered part of It isn't in the national income and product accounts as something that the U.S. economy is producing. Facebook isn't considered part of gross domestic product, right? We don't count that in the national product accounts. Ad revenue is the proxy for these new services. I mean, it's clearly consumption. When you are watching, when you are people who are spending hours and hours on Facebook and TikTok, when searching things on the internet, you are clearly consuming. That is consumer behavior. But you are not that is not considered in the NIPA accounts consumption. What is it in there is advertising, and advertising is essentially a proxy for these new for the value of these services. And it is, like I said, it is a growing share of our economy. Next slide. And as I said at the outset, it's highly concentrated. So this is right now, it's already over half Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon, and that's projected to grow in the coming years. So go ahead to the next slide. So why are policymakers coming to this right now? I think they're actually coming from a number of different directions. So one is the issue of the mental health harms of increasingly manipulative platforms. And we just saw today a massive legal settlement. Meta will be paying huge amounts of money to states to compensate for the harmful ways that these platforms have been harming, particularly teens and children. So there is, and it's so in that case you could sort of think about it almost like we think about a cigarette tax or an alcohol tax, right? A tax on something that has broad social harms. Another place people are coming at it is just the way that these platforms are undermining traditional journalism and by extension democracy. There's also tremendous concerns about how our data is being extracted and collected and used. And so in this case, you might, and Michael will speak more about it, you might think about it as an analogy to, we tax coal that is extracted from the ground. We tax lumber when it is extracted from the land. So we might think about the extraction and use of our personal data that way. And then, everything I've been saying about the sales tax base, the loss of revenue that is occurring by failing to tax advertising. So, I think there's two big arguments for taxing targeted ads or all ads. One is, and this is sort of in addition to we need the revenue. There's lots of ways you can raise the revenue, and it's always important to keep an eye on the fact that part of the reason is we would take the revenue and we would use it on services that are critical for our communities. But two reasons, particularly to tax advertising. One is sort of that excise tax function, the social harms, and certainly, and the other broad argument is the issue of sales tax parity. I want to spend a minute more on sales tax parity issues because it really is a leveling the playing field thing. Go on to the next slide. And so I'll give you an example. Aditi pointed out that Netflix, we do pay tax. Netflix does pay tax under the Ohio General Sales Tax, but only on subscription purchases, right? So to the extent that people are, paying that reduced rate for a subscription, and the remainder is subsidized by the sale of ads that you have to sit and watch, the ad sales proportion is not taxed. So you have this sort of unequal treatment of different kinds of streaming service, different kinds of digital services under current Ohio sales tax law. And so you've got a tax code that is biased in favor of ad-funded platforms over subscription businesses. Now there's an objection that we hear a lot. Well, we don't generally, go on to the next slide. It is often argued that advertising is a business input. And there's generally an case that is made that says to the extent that it's possible and feasible, we're going to try not to tax to levy sales tax on business inputs. Or the sales tax is supposed to be a tax on consumption, on final consumption. Um, so we should continue not to tax advertising because it's a business input. I think there's a few different ways to respond to this argument. One is that advertising is just different. There's really, it's not a, it is a triangle shaped transaction. It's really two different transactions. There's the ad sale itself, but there's also the way the platform is delivering directly to the consumer this content that is not otherwise taxed. Um, a second argument against this business input thing is that the business input argument is really driven by the concept of pyramiding. Pyramiding is the idea that, hey, we don't both tax lumber, the sale of lumber, and that is used to make the chair, and then turn around and tax the chair itself. If we're going to tax the chair itself, we shouldn't be taxing the sale of the lumber that's made that's sold to make the chair. In this case, business to business ads are only about 5 to 6% of all digital ads. We're not actually talking about a tax that is hitting multiple layers of production. And the reality of modern state sales taxes is they are, to a significant degree, on purchase business to business sales. So it's not like the existing sales tax is this pure thing that is only levied on consumer purchases. It's just not. So let's get to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what other states are in fact doing, because just in the last year or so, when I started looking into it, several states have moved on this. Now, for a long time, Hawaii and New Mexico have taxed all advertising under their sales taxes. There's been really no controversy about that. Plenty of experience. The Hawaii and New Mexico are known for having very broad-based general sales taxes, and they tax advertising. New Mexico, a couple of years ago, actually clarified, yep, our sales tax includes digital ads, includes ads over the internet. So that's one possible model, is just to say, just going to tax all advertising, just add advertising to the tax base, just as it is a part of the commercial activities tax. A wrinkle on this model is what Washington State did last year. They added advertising to the sales tax base, all advertising, but then they exempted newspapers and broadcast. They essentially exempted traditional media. Still raised a projected pretty significant amount of revenue they project. The other examples are what Maryland did in 2001. Earlier this year, Illinois and Utah all have done standalone taxes. They're justified in part by the fact that the state sales tax doesn't tax ads, but they are structured as standalone taxes. Illinois is a 10% tax on targeted ads. Utah is actually set at the same rate as the state sales tax rate, but it is in statute. It has its own section of the code. And these taxes are specifically on targeted or digital ads. And Utah and Illinois and Utah in particular focus on this concept of targeted ads that are not shown to just anybody who logs onto a medium or opens a newspaper. They are ads that are designed to get at particular individuals based on their personal data, which is increasingly the norm for all advertising. But I think Michael will say a little more about why that distinction is important. And this is obviously of great interest to policymakers in lots of other states. People are thinking about it, looking at it. And I would expect to see in 2027 more states seriously consider following suit. Let me wrap up with some design questions that we want to talk about. So one is, how would this work, right? Do we have to are we saying that companies have to collect the IP addresses for everybody in the state who's somehow measure the amount of Facebook that everybody's sitting there? No. We already have a bunch of mechanisms Um, the technical term is destination-based sourcing for companies to know who are they delivering various services to in the state. You establish in law the taxes where the ad is viewed, um, not where it's coming from. So, um, and the platforms, for the most part, already know where folks are sitting. Um, but to the extent that they don't, there are a set of reasonable rules of thumb that the companies use. Again, this is already pretty common to estimate what share of your ad revenue might you associate with a given state. So this turns out not to be all that significant of an issue. Um, and increasingly, now that there are several other states doing it, they are already developing rules that Ohio can learn from. Washington State has already put out a set of preliminary regulations about how its tax will be calculated. Um, and in Washington State, it's also applied to local sales taxes, which piggyback on the state. So there is actually an opportunity for local governments to get revenue from that tax as well. The second question is who ultimately pays, and we hear a lot of one of the main arguments used against this is, oh no, this is going to be passed on to little advertisers for whom Google is sort of a lifeline. You know, if I'm in a small town in Ohio and I'm making some product, but I can use Google ads to get the word out nationwide, this is going to hit me. I really don't think it is. I think we don't know yet exactly how taxes like this are going to where the incidence is going to fall. But I think a reasonable assumption is that the platforms will absorb most of the costs. And here's why. These are in this modern world of advertising, these ads are sold at auction in real time. So they are already being sold to the highest bidder. They are already being sold at the maximum amount the market will bear. Whether or not a tax is incorporated into that sort of doesn't matter. The price an advertiser pays is the price that sort of the next advertiser in line is willing to pay. So they're already the companies are already extracting the maximum price from the advertiser they possibly can. They're not passing more, and so this won't really cause them to pass more along. That's my best guess for how, generally we're pretty suspicious of any consumption taxes. Generally, we're pretty concerned that consumption taxes will wind up landing on ordinary consumers. I think that's less the case with this than it would be for many other kinds of consumption taxes. So go ahead to the next slide. Just to kind of wrap it up, I say four design considerations. I only have three here, but one design consideration is you do want to go pretty broad if you can, raise more revenue and maybe legally safe it. So I think there's a case to be made for taxing all advertising. I do understand, though, targeted advertising is sort of where the political momentum is. And so states are very understandably focusing on that right now. Again, there are places are considering taking some of the revenue and targeting it to where the harm is. Mental health services, support for local journalism. The most important point here is the last one. This is not a substitute for adequate taxation of capital income. In no way can we let a tax like this somehow replace just having a strong tax on corporate activity, on wealthy individuals. And that's critically important. There's a lot of things we don't know about how this tax is going to actually play out. And I would be really disappointed if states were to pass a tax like this and then it were to sort of buy out other parts of the tax base. So last slide. So again, exempting advertising is something that has existed for 90 years. The world of advertising is totally different. And so leaving that exemption in place now, you're subsidizing the most profitable companies in history. We could be raising hundreds of $millions a year for schools and healthcare and roads. And, other states are already paving the way. So I think the case is pretty strong for Ohio to at least explore this. And I'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nick. And then we're handing it over to Mike.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation to talk to you today. My presentation, as you see, I'm titling it Minimizing the Legal Vulnerabilities of Digital Services Taxes. And my message is, in the first instance, draft them right the first time, which, as I'll discuss, many states haven't done. And also consider the alternative approach to this that Aditi referred to earlier, which is data mining taxes. So it's really important to understand that legal for any state considering new digital service taxes, one sort or another, to be aware that legal challenges to any new form of taxation on this industry are inevitable. We are talking about companies like Alphabet, Meta, Apple, X. They are among the wealthiest corporations on the planet, and their billionaire owners are determined to block any new type of state and local taxes on these industries. And if they don't succeed in blocking them in the legislatures, they'll turn to the courts. And so it's vital that new taxes on this industry or these services are carefully drafted from the outset to minimize the chances of success of such litigation. The litigation is going to happen, but how the laws are drafted can have a significant effect on whether there's sustained in court or not. So there are a number of grounds on which these taxes can and in fact are currently being challenged in courts. And the greatest vulnerability to challenge comes under the 1998 Internet Tax Freedom Act, which, among other things, has an explicit ban on the levying by state and local governments of what are termed discriminatory taxes on electronic commerce. And electronic commerce basically means any transaction conducted over the internet. And a discriminatory tax is defined as any tax imposed on electronic commerce, that is internet transactions, that is not quote unquote generally imposed on transactions involving quote unquote similar goods, property, services, or information accomplished through other means. And I'll just note that those key words, generally imposed and similar property, goods, or services, is not defined in the statute. And that's what a lot of the litigation is revolved around. So this prohibition should be surmountable. That is, the states, in theory, should be able to overcome the Internet Tax Freedom Act when they want to impose some of these taxes. For one thing, the jurisprudence surrounding federal preemption of state taxing authority is very clear that laws like ITFA need to be interpreted as narrowly as possible because state taxation is a key aspect of state sovereignty. You can't have a state government without the power to tax. So given this jurisprudence and given the wording of the Internet Tax Freedom Act, in theory, for example, a gross receipts tax on social media, if social media is carefully defined in the law, should pass muster under ITFA, since there's no quote unquote similar offline service in existence that could be discriminated against by failing to tax it when social media is taxed. Likewise, a gross receipts tax on online advertising that's targeted to a specific viewer using information about them should pass muster under ITFA as long as forms of non-internet advertising that can be similarly targeted, such as satellite or cable TV advertising. When you subscribe to a pay-per-view movie, I guarantee you, your cable TV company is, gathering information on the kind of movies you'd like to watch. So other forms of non-internet advertising can be targeted, and as long as those are targeted, as long as those are taxed, targeted online advertising should pass muster. But notwithstanding what I just said, many of you may be aware that just in the last couple of weeks, the tax court in Maryland recently held that Maryland's digital advertising tax does discriminate as defined under ITFA against online commerce because TV and print and billboard and other kinds of advertising are not subject to tax. Now, it was a very troubling decision, I'm told by the lawyers who understand this area of law. The judge gave no consideration to all this federal preemption jurisprudence that said he should have gone out of his way to interpret the term similar very narrowly. He gave no consideration to all the evidence that was presented to him that targeted automated advertising was in fact very dissimilar to TV print advertising. In fact, he went through a long litany of things and then said, well, it's clear that all of these things that TV and targeted advertising are very similar. And he listed among the things that made them similar was targeting and cost, where the reality is that, TV advertising is not targeted. And the judge clearly started out with a bias in favor of an overbroad interpretation of ITFA, as evidenced by the fact that he made a statement in the decision that ITFA was intended to bar all taxation of online services when its legislative history clearly demonstrates the opposite. So it was an unfortunate decision. And Maryland clearly will appeal the case, and it will go on for a number of years. But in the meantime, what should states who are considering these kinds of laws do to minimize the risk of a successful ITFA challenge? Well, the first thing they should do is be aware that ITFA exists, and advocates on the call should make sure that legislators are aware that ITFA exists, because frankly, there's no evidence at all that when the Maryland tax was drafted, the legislators were aware that ITFA existed. I mean, there's no evidence that they consulted any national experts on state taxation when they drafted it. After legal challenges to the law had already been filed, the Maryland Comptroller, which is the tax enforcement agency, issued guidance saying that it only applied to visual programmatic online advertising, that is targeted advertising using the kinds of instantaneous auction that Nick talked about, and not all online advertising, but by then sort of the damage had been done. So as Nick said, states pursuing similar taxes on digital advertising in the future absolutely should limit the application of the law in the statute as they write the bill to limit it to this form of advertising. And as Nick said, Utah and Illinois recently adopted similar ad taxes that were limited to targeted advertising, and they used very similar language to what the Maryland Comptroller drafted in the guidance that was ignored in the litigation. As Nick said, I think the best way of making digital advertising taxes ITFA proof is to just tax all advertising. I mean, I think that continues to be a very real risk now that we have this Maryland precedent that judges will interpret even targeted interactive advertising as an ITFA violation, even if the law is written that way from the beginning, which of course wasn't in Maryland. So as Nick said, I think states should therefore give serious consideration to taxing all sales of advertising space or time, including on broadcast television and radio. I think that should solve the ITFA problem and potential First Amendment legal issues that I'll talk about in a minute. So mechanically, that's a simple thing to do. Politically, obviously, it's much more difficult because you're talking about mobilizing TV stations and newspapers and so on, whereas now, it's limited to online companies. But perhaps that political opposition can be mitigated somewhat if there's a threshold of receipts below which the tax doesn't apply. Um, so that's ITFA. But digital advertising taxes can also be vulnerable to to challenges under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, claiming that they discriminate against interstate commerce. And that is particularly the case when states choose, as Maryland did, to base both the threshold at which the gross receipts threshold at which the tax began to apply, as well as the tax rates, which were progressive under the Maryland tax, not on the level of gross receipts attributed to advertising delivered in Maryland, but instead the level of gross receipts that the companies had from delivering advertising services worldwide. And so the Maryland tax was also invalidated on a Commerce Clause challenge because they were basically saying that, the court was saying, and the opponents of the tax were saying, the threshold was set so high that, many in-state Maryland businesses wouldn't be subject to the tax at all because the market for advertising in Maryland was small, but the worldwide market was obviously much larger. And so basing the threshold on a worldwide market and a tax rate on the level of worldwide advertising receipts meant that out-of-state companies were being disadvantaged relative to in-state Maryland companies. Now, again, there's some jurisprudence that suggests that such kind of provisions can pass muster under the Commerce Clause, but I would argue that this was sort of an own goal on Maryland's part. The risk of having the tax invalidated is not worth basing the taxability threshold or progressive tax rates on the level of in-state activity. And so states shouldn't do this going forward if they're going to enact this kind of tax. Finally, digital advertising taxes can also be vulnerable to First Amendment challenges. For example, a number of states have limited their digital advertising taxes to social media. And this is completely understandable. As Nick said, social media are clearly inflicting some unique harms on our society, but it's also risky because state taxes have been held to violate the First Amendment when they favor some forms of speech over others. So taxing an advertisement when it appears on a social media site, but not when it appears elsewhere online, could be held to disfavor social media platforms. So I think as we saw with the settlement with Meta today that the states reached, it may be better to mitigate the harms of social media through regulation rather than taxation. So again, best not to have a very broad application of these taxes, not to limit it to social media. So the other thing I wanted to talk about today is the possibility of an alternative approach, perhaps potentially less legally vulnerable approach to taxing online platforms. Several academics have recognized consumer data as sort of the new oil in the economy. That is an incredibly valuable resource that really forms the basis of the entire economy, consumer economy these days, and have advocated the equivalent of a severance tax on it. In 2021, a bill was introduced in the New York Senate that would impose a flat monthly per person tax on the maintenance or use by any business of data that can be tied to a specific New York resident individual consumer. So we're talking about demographic information about that person, their purchasing history, their online search history, and the tax would apply if the seller had the advertising or the company had data other than routine contact information for their customers. And the tax crucially, the tax would apply regardless of the mechanism by which the data were obtained. So if the data were obtained by someone's internet use, yes, they would be subject to the tax. The company would be subject for the tax, but that would also apply to an airline that had a frequent flyer program, or a supermarket that where you showed a frequent buyer card, or if you purchased the data from a data broker. Um, Other provisions of the New York tax were that there was a threshold before the tax applied of the company having consumer-specific information on at least 1 million consumers per month before the tax would apply to the company. It had a graduated rate structure of starting with 5 cents per month on companies that had between 1 million and 2 million New York customers, up to 50 cents per month on companies that had more than 10 million New York consumers. And it also authorized the Revenue Department to negotiate formula-based calculations of the tax rather than forcing the company to, actually count the number of people on whom they had New York consumer information. Earlier this year, the principal drafter of this New York bill, an attorney named Rob Plattner, a law professor named Darian Shansky, who many of you have probably heard of, and myself tweaked the New York bill a bit to make it a model for consideration by other states. So we added some legislative findings providing brief rationale for the tax, and we made various technical changes. For example, changes aimed at helping the companies subject to the tax determine whether someone was a New York resident or not. And this model is available online. If you just Google my last name, Maserov, and put model data tax, you'll find a link to it. And it's also in the slides that will be sent to you later. So what are some of the advantages, I think, of this approach, just in terms of kind of rationale and technical features? Some people have proposed data mining taxes that would be based on the value of the data, and of course, that's an incredibly difficult and litigation-prone aspect that would be difficult. But the New York tax proposes a head count approach to the tax, and that should be very readily administrable. In terms of rationale, this tax taxes companies for one of the harms of their business models that is widely felt by consumers. That is the gathering of massive amounts of personal data about them and the concerns about the loss of privacy and the potential for hacking of that data by people not authorized to have it, the risk of identity theft, et cetera. So the public at large I think would get the rationale for a tax that's based on the amount of consumer data that's collected on them. And then more importantly, and really what motivated Rob Plattner to draft this tax in the way he did, was that it really should ultimately, it's going to be, as I said, it's going to be challenged in court, and indeed a version of this tax that's been imposed in Illinois and the city of Chicago has already been challenged in court. But ultimately, I think it should prove invulnerable to both ITFA and Commerce Clause and First Amendment challenges if it's drafted properly. And most importantly, as I said, it's not a tax on a transaction, which under the definition for ITFA I gave you earlier, it's a tax on property. It's a tax on a form of property that these companies maintain, information about their customers. And moreover, more importantly, it applies to all consumer data, not just data acquired from consumers' use of the internet. And in terms of the potential Commerce Clause challenge, as long as the taxability threshold is not set so high that companies can make a credible case that it's only aimed at non-New York businesses, it should be sustained against the Commerce Clause challenge. In terms of disadvantages, again, the same with the, extending digital advertising taxes to all form of advertising. You're bringing in a lot more potential opponents. Now, airlines and supermarket chains, will likely oppose this tax. And it's also true that this is sort of a novel form of taxation. And whenever you have a new form of taxation, there's going to be legitimate, unanticipated compliance and enforcement issues, and those will need to be worked out. Just in terms of lay of the land on these taxes, the New York tax has been introduced several times since 2021, but it has not advanced. But as I mentioned, Illinois and Chicago have both enacted data taxes. But again, sort of going back to the lesson I've been trying to hammer here, they limited the tax, the application of these data taxes to social media companies. And so they have opened themselves up to both First Amendment challenges and Internet Tax Freedom Act challenges. And so, again, to hammer home the message, don't do that. If you're considering these kinds of taxes, make them as broad as possible, and do everything you can to avoid successful Commerce Clause, First Amendment, and Internet Tax Freedom Act based challenges. And so, just in conclusion, if people on this call are interested in considering this form of tax for Ohio, I would urge you to look closely at the Plattner, Shansky, Maserov model that we wrote earlier this year. And thanks, and I'll stop there and we'll look forward to questions.
All right, thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, we'll be taking questions. And just as a heads up, there are slides that Michael has created just to kind of provide some more context for some of the explanations he gave, and that will be in the slide deck that's shared out. Also, the paper that Michael just noted, the Plattner, Maserov, Shansky paper, will also be shared out in our resources. So we will now take any questions that folks have. And you can come off of mute if that is easier to you.